Imagine yourself waking up to the sound of metal clashing, not from a dream, because your sleep is not truly sleep. Only a fleeting loss of consciousness on a hard wooden plank that doesn't deserve to be called a bed. The air is thick with ammonia and sweat, coal dust and dead skin. The sun has not yet risen, but you know it is time to work. You don't know what day it is, but it doesn't matter. In the Gulag, time is not measured by calendars. His face struck the ice, and he didn't get back up. Only a place more shielded from the wind, and fellow humans who also want to keep living. There are no bedtime stories, only groans, only silence, and voiceless prayers directed to who knows where. Maybe to God, if he hasn't forgotten places like this. Or maybe to memory, so you don't vanish completely from the world. No one stopped working, because a single second of stopping could mean a day without food. That you are in a place where humans are forced to live like shadows. You don't want to remember who you once were, because that memory hurts. All that exists is now. And now is night and winter in Siberia, in a gulag that erases names, faces, and hope. And a day without food in a place like this is one step closer to the snow-covered grave. Time is measured by one thing only: whether you are still breathing tomorrow. The air is colder than death itself. Your fingers, once soft and nimble, are now stiff like frozen twigs. You try to move your legs so they don't go numb. But every movement stabs your bones with shards of ice, as if the world is intentionally erasing human traces, so history won't have to remember those who were discarded. The shovels begin to dig into the frozen earth. You work to survive the cold that can kill you slowly. Your sweat freezes on your skin. Your breath becomes mist from another world. The sound of shovels, coughing, and occasional cries of pain becomes the symphony of your days. There is no music, no color, only blinding white and gray that freezes the soul. But what they dig up is not just soil. 'Tis the remnants of dignity, memories, even the future. The guards don't speak much. They just point, and everyone knows what it means. Down, out, walk, line up, work. There is no breakfast to warm your heart, only thin soup that tastes like a shadow of flavor, and hard bread that could break your teeth. But everyone eats, because if they don't, they know their body won't be strong enough to dig today. And if you don't dig, you don't survive. There is no choice, no protest. Because a voice is a luxury in this place. Your steps head toward snow that buries everything. Snow so thick, so silent, so cruel. You work not to complete something. There's a man beside you. You don't know his name, but he smiled at you yesterday. Today he fell. When night comes, you return to the barrack, but no warmth awaits. And when you close your eyes, you don't hope for a beautiful dream, but a dream dark enough to help you forget. There comes a time when your body stops resisting, when the cold no longer bites, but blends with your blood. When hunger no longer feels painful, it just becomes part of your being. Those faces are gaunt, their eyes empty, their cheeks sunken. But a strange bond forms, a kind of unspoken solidarity. It just exists. It is simply felt. This is not strength, but the body slowly surrendering. Those who survive here are not the strongest, but the quietest, the most resigned, the ones who have disappeared within themselves. You begin to recognize the same faces each day, not because they smile or greet you, but because they are still alive. They are the timeline moving with you. Or maybe it's a sign they are no longer truly here. But no one laughs at them, because everyone knows only time separates sanity from ruin. Today, it's him. Tomorrow, it might be you. And you return to the barracks with a lighter body and a heavier soul. Tomorrow morning, you may wake again, if you're lucky. And life will repeat like a stone rolled uphill with no purpose, no end. You don't know if it will ever end, but you know one thing: no one truly lives in a place like this. There are only remnants of people still trying to survive in silence. Each night, bodies lie pressed together, not out of friendship, but out of necessity, because even time loses its meaning in a place like this. There is no spring, no birthdays, no holidays. Only an endless winter and numbers that keep shrinking. Number of inmates, number of voices, number of names still remembered. And to remember is to hurt. So slowly, your mind erases the past. Good food, warm blankets, even the sound of laughter. They all become like fairy tales that never really happened. What exists is only today, and today is digging. Today is enduring. Today is surviving, even if you don't know why. The body heat of another person becomes the only warmth left. In a place like this, privacy is a laughable memory. There is no room for shame, no space to be alone. You don't know who sleeps next to you. But it doesn't matter, because everyone is the same. Equally cold, equally hungry, equally forgotten. You remember your mother's voice once? Maybe it's just an echo from the past. Or maybe a part of you still wants to believe the outside world hasn't completely disappeared. But in a place like this, there is no direction. The forest, the ice, and the silence form a prison far larger than any barbed wire. He was caught 3 days later, or maybe just 2. Nothing is certain, but one thing is, he didn't return with his legs, and after that, no one tried to escape again. But that voice is soft, like a dream that keeps fading. Even her face is beginning to blur. With each passing day, memory becomes like snow, covered, dulled, and vanishing into whiteness. There was once a man who tried to escape. He ran during a snowstorm, thinking it would cover his tracks. You learn that hope can be poison, because to hope means you still remember a better world. Some begin to talk to themselves, sentences that make no sense, spoken to no one. Maybe it's how their souls survive. And you ask yourself silently, how long will this go on? But even that question begins to fade. And so night comes again. The snow still falls. The wind still lashes. On a night not so different from all the others, the snow falls silently, like dust from a sky that no longer cares. Behind a small window frosted with ice, you sit without a word. Not asleep, but not fully awake either. Because when your eyes close, your body feels every wound it has held back all day. But that's only temporary. In a matter of days, they too will become shadows like the rest. Everything will fade. Names, hopes, even body shapes. All will dissolve into this white and gray landscape where everything loses its form. The cracked bones, the split skin, the lungs scorched by freezing air. No prayer, just a body wrapped and taken away, and that bed is quickly filled by another. As if life moves on without ever truly recording who came and who left. Perhaps that is the coldest thing of all, not the ice, but how quickly a person can be forgotten. And if you're unlucky enough to dream, the dream is no escape, not for great sins, but for surviving. Because in a place like this, survival feels like betrayal. Betrayal to those who died, to those who gave up, to the part of yourself that once believed justice existed. You begin to wonder whether you are still human or just an old machine waiting to break down. You will dream of warm bread, the sound of children, sunlight. Not out of forgetfulness, but because the count no longer matters. What day, what month, what year? All those questions fall into nothingness. Only one thing matters. The next morning, will these eyes open again? Will this heart beat again? And if they do, is that a victory or just another sentence added to your time? And when you wake, that sense of loss will strike harder than any blow. Just trapped in an endless pause between exhaustion and emptiness. The sounds outside are nothing but the wind whispering stories no one wants to hear. Perhaps tales of those who never returned. Or maybe just pure silence, born from a cold and indifferent world. In this barrack, there are no dreams. Even sleep feels like another form of punishment. Sometimes, new people arrive, new faces. Their clothes are still intact. Their eyes still hold questions. Still filled with fear, not yet eroded by time. Winter in the Gulag is not just about temperature. It is a force that slowly crushes the soul, like a mountain of snow pressing on your chest. The air entering your lungs feels like tiny knives. There is no shelter from that pain. Even inside your own mind, the cold creeps in. Shadows drifting at the edge of your sight. Voices calling from within the wind. But you are not afraid. There is no room for fear here. Even death, in the end, is not a threat. It is more like a small door, always present in your peripheral vision, waiting to be opened at any moment. It erases stories of the past, destroys the concept of future, and freezes you into a single point with no direction. You begin to see things that are not there. Maybe because of fever. Maybe because your mind is tired. Tiny lights dancing in the corners of the room. On some nights, someone doesn't wake up. Usually, there is no ceremony. Among all this, one thing clings like mist: guilt. And at some point, you stop counting the days. Morning arrives without a sound, but your body knows. It is not the kind of morning that brings hope, but the signal that the cycle begins again. The sky remains gray, the sun only a faint glimmer behind the fog. There is no rooster's crow, no smell of toast, only the sound of a guard's heavy boots hitting the frozen ground. You rise not because you've rested enough, but because your body is too sore to remain lying down. You rise because the barracks are too cold to die silently. Outside, the line of people begins to form, silent, orderly, and cold. He was once a professor, or maybe just a carpenter. No one really knows. But each time you look at him, there's something in his eyes that hasn't gone out. Not hope, but a kind of resolve. As if he carries the memories of those who can no longer remember. You don't know his name, but his presence makes you feel not entirely alone. There is no chatter, only frozen breaths hanging in the air. And you keep walking even as your legs begin to feel like stone. There are no good nights, no embraces, only bodies lying down again, trying to gather the leftover warmth from a day that stole everything. And in the dark, you stare at the ceiling, trying to imagine a world where morning means a beginning, not another punishment. Sometimes you feel like your body is a shadow, present but not truly alive. But that's what's needed here, to be a shadow, not too visible, not too weak, just enough to exist, enough to survive, enough to disappear. There is no Monday or Friday, no holidays, only work. Endless, pointless work that never feels complete. Digging frozen earth, lifting stones, chopping trees, stacking logs. Not to build anything meaningful, just to slowly destroy, sometimes without. A hard piece of bread that must be soaked before it can be chewed. But here, no one complains. Because complaining is a luxury, and hoping for more is foolish. You eat not to feel full, but to keep the body working for another day. The body, time, and belief. Some cough, long, deep coughs that sound like they come from cracked lungs, but no one pays attention. Here, illness has no meaning. Sickness is just another part of the routine. If you can stand, you are healthy enough to work. That's the only standard. Days in the Gulag do not differ from one another. Your hands no longer feel real. Your fingers become foreign objects that simply obey without connection. You don't work with enthusiasm nor out of fear, but through habit. Like a wheel that keeps turning even though its axle is cracked. Words become too expensive to waste. Even stories vanish. Once there may have been tales of home, of love, of freedom. But now, no one repeats them. Not because they're forgotten, but because saying them hurts too much. There are moments of pause, usually just enough for a quick breath and a blank stare at the sky. But the sky does not respond. It merely watches, as if it too doesn't want to be involved. Food comes like a ritual stripped of emotion. A bowl of gray liquid they call soup, sometimes with small pieces of potato. You begin to notice that language changes too. There are no more long conversations, only orders, short murmurs, or complete silence. There's an old man who works beside you. He never speaks, but his gaze is deep. The days spin unlike a rusted wheel forced along a frozen path. And when night comes again, like an old god that never tires, you return to the barracks. There are rare moments in the Gulag nights when everything is so still that even the sound of falling snow seems like a whisper. In those moments, your mind begins to rebel. It refuses to be still. Long murmurs, like prayers, or maybe repeating nightmares. Some call out names of people no longer alive. Some laugh softly like children. Here, dreams aren't an escape. Dreams can be traps. Because once you remember that the world outside still exists, the suffering inside becomes even sharper. Many of us learn to avoid dreaming. Sleep is only a way to skip time, not to wish, but it's enough to fill the empty space in the barracks. They write on walls, on scraps of wood, even inside their shirts. Sitting on a hard bed, arms around your knees, eyes blank. It is the feeling that you are being forgotten, that the world continues without realizing you are still holding on. That in the middle of this frost and shadow, there is still a heart beating, slowly, but not yet gone. Sometimes you think about what it felt like to laugh. Not a polite smile, but real, reckless laughter. It feels foreign now, as if it belonged to another life. Someone who never passed through these iron gates. But faintly, you know it existed, and that is enough, not to be remembered, but to avoid being erased. Every letter is resistance against the loss of meaning, against the erasure of existence. Because in a world that erases names and stories, writing a single sentence can be an act of eternity. There's no applause, no encore. Just a brief pause that turns the air a little warmer. These songs are like flickers of light in the fog, reminding us that the human soul cannot be completely broken. It searches desperately for something to remember. Sometimes a face, sometimes a name, sometimes just the outline of a door. But strangely, the harder you try to recall, the blurrier everything becomes. As if time here, frozen and cruel, also freezes the past, making it brittle, shattered, and slowly fading. Some prisoners begin to speak in their sleep. Sometimes someone doesn't wake up. Their bodies remain on the wooden bed, stiff but peaceful. There are no calendars, no red dates, no birthdays. Days are just an endless sequence between rising and falling again. Outside, the world might be changing. Countries might be negotiating. But inside, time is frozen, like blood thickened by cold. And slowly, you stop caring. No weeping, no ceremony. They are taken away before the sun rises. After living too long between orders, silence, and groans, even your own voice becomes a way to confirm you're still alive, that there is still a tremble in the chest, an echo in the throat. Because in a place like this, silence can cut deeper than the guards' whips. In silence, only the faint scent of their last breath lingers. A reminder that this place is not merely a prison, but a gateway to somewhere else that cannot be refused. Death is not a major event here. It is just part of the daily count. You begin to lose time. Months become foreign concepts. Years feel like jokes. Some begin to talk to themselves, not out of madness, but for the comfort of human sound. On certain nights, someone hums a song, an old tune with half-forgotten lyrics, sung by a trembling mouth. Some still write. With charcoal, with fingernails, with anything. And you, ... you are still here. Because the most painful thing is not the whip, not the cold, not the hunger. Each morning arrives without promise. There's no golden light to warm the skin. Only the shifting shadows on the wooden wall signal it's time to rise. The biting cold grabs your joints before your feet even touch the floor. Sometimes you have to slap your limbs just to make sure they're still alive, still capable of movement. Outside, the air cuts like a knife. A white fog hangs low, stabbing the lungs with every breath, and bread hard as stone. Yet still, it's considered a blessing. Many eat carefully, as if it might be their last meal, and often it is. There's no guarantee, no notice. Today you eat, tomorrow you might not. In a place like this, even hunger must be taught to wait patiently. And before the sun fully rises, you'll already be standing in formation, counted like a number, then thrown into another day of labor that knows no mercy. You work until night swallows the light, until you can't tell the snow on the ground from the stars in the sky. And when you're finally allowed back to the barracks, your body is an empty sack. Your mind is fog. Your spirit is silent. Even sitting feels like another exhausting task, but you sit anyway. Because it is the last small form of rebellion you have left. To sit, to be still. To endure. Labor in the Gulag isn't meant to achieve something. It's not about production or purpose. It exists only to break you, to waste time, energy, and hope. You chop wood that will never be used. Dig soil that will never be planted. It only means harder work. Hands freeze quicker. Metal tools stick to bare skin if touched without gloves. And if you fall or slow down or grow too tired, punishment waits. Sometimes in the form of yelling, sometimes blows. Sometimes your food portion mysteriously shrinks. The Gulag allows no weakness as excuse. Weakness is a sin, and the only redemption is more suffering. Haul stones from one spot to another, only to be told to return them to the original place the next morning. None of it is about construction. Sometimes death. But what's more terrifying is not the punishment itself. It's the way other prisoners look at them. Not with admiration, but with fear. Because every act of defiance only brings more pain to everyone else. And so, over time, even courage becomes taboo. It's no longer a symbol of hope, but a trigger for collective torment. It is about the slow and systematic destruction of the human soul. And day by day, you see people lose the light in their eyes. They become bodies that move by command, not by will. Sometimes the weather turns worse. Snow falls heavily. The wind howls like a wild beast. But that doesn't mean a break. There are rare moments when someone tries to resist, refuses an order, tries to escape, but it always ends the same way. Capture, beatings. Lunch is not a break. It's an insulting pause. Watery porridge. A spoonful of sour vegetables nearly rotten. After lunch, work continues. Hands begin to bleed. Backs feel like they're breaking, but there's no stopping. No excuses. Inside the barrack, the atmosphere isn't much better. Warmth is not a word known here. Wooden walls creak against the outer wind, but the cold still seeps in like a ghost that knows the weakest cracks. Sometimes the short gasps of someone who cannot stop shivering. Sometimes a body is carried out like an old sack. Sometimes it is left until morning comes and labor calls. Death here doesn't stir the heart. It is too common, too frequent, too quiet. No one weeps loudly. No one screams from loss. Everyone knows that tears only make your cheeks colder. A soft voice, barely audible, but warm enough to touch a corner of the heart. Only one quiet wish hums in every prisoner's heart. That tomorrow they'll wake up again. And if they don't, may death come gently. Not through blows, not through hunger, but with deep and quiet sleep, like a warm blanket that has finally come to carry them away. Sometimes there's a small laugh when someone slips in the mud. Not from joy, but because the body still remembers how to laugh, and that itself is a miracle. Sometimes just a piece of extra bread makes everyone fall silent with hope, as if witnessing a miracle. And from those tiny moments, a sense of life can rise again, even if only for a breath. Occasionally, faint whispers about home, about a mother, about a wife somewhere unknown. No clocks, only changes in weather and the deepening sense of fatigue. Scratching names into the wall with a rusted nail, drawing their child's face with charcoal, stitching tiny marks into clothing with smuggled thread. But all of it can be punished if found. Because in the Gulag, identity is a sin. You are no one. You must be no one. Only obedience matters. Your existence is recorded in numbers, not in names, not in memory. Sometimes someone asks what month it is, what year, but no one really knows. And strangely, no one truly cares anymore. Time loses its meaning when every day feels the same. When life is just a cycle of cold, hunger, and endless orders. All that exists is today. And even that is uncertain. These stories become more like mantras, repeated not to be heard, but so they're not forgotten. Because the only way to remain human is to remember that once you had a life. You laughed once. You once slept in a place that did not pierce your bones. People's breath forms mist in the air, sometimes freezing into their beards. Bodies cling to each other, not out of friendship, but just to survive the brutal temperature. Blankets are never enough, and the straw beneath does little to soften the bite of the frozen wooden floor. Even sleep becomes a test. Every night is a gamble. Who will wake up and who will freeze in silence? The sounds of the Gulag at night are not lullabies. Sometimes there's quiet weeping. People come and go. Some are transferred, some simply vanish. And others just don't wake up. There is no announcement, no ceremony. Time passes silently. There are no calendars. Some try to do small things to remember who they are, and yet traces of light still persist. Sometimes someone sings a song from their village. When the night fully covers the day and the body starts to sink into heavy sleep, no long prayers are said. Even within the ruins of those frozen days, there was always one figure who stood out. Not for his strength, not for his height or pride, but for his unbroken silence, his distant gaze that pierced through wooden walls, and his steady walk, even as his body had thinned like a brittle branch. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, he would sit in the corner of the barrack, carefully shaping small pieces of wood into something unclear. People glanced, but never asked. Yet everyone knew he was crafting something. Of identity, of home, of mothers hanging laundry, of children sleeping in warm laps. Empty, and on the straw lay a small wooden house with the door slightly ajar. They didn't break fences, didn't overthrow guards, but they saved what mattered most. The feeling that we once had a past, and perhaps, even if only perhaps, that we might still have a future. As if saying he had left for somewhere warmer, and no one dared to touch it. The object stayed there for weeks, until one day it was simply gone, carried off by the wind or quietly taken by someone who wanted to believe that the house could still be reached. And they didn't come to comfort us, but to hurt. Because they made us feel alive, and to feel alive in a place like this was a wound without healing. Yet through that pain, we knew we weren't fully dead, that the heart still beat, that memory still breathed, a shape that looked like a house, or maybe a boat. Maybe it was only imagination, but in the Gulag, even a splinter of wood could be a symbol. And from his rough hands, the object slowly took form, then was tucked gently under the straw blanket like a small treasure. He wasn't a leader, not a figure of rank, and owned no more than the rest. Tiny houses, little boats, animals made from wooden scraps. And every time one of us was close to giving up, someone would find one of those little things in their bed. Left quietly, no message, no words. Just a small shape of something that once existed in the outside world. A house, a chicken, a dog, a river. Forms that reminded us that the world was not always like this. That somewhere else, barbed wire and watchtowers didn't exist. But everyone knew, if someone were to last the longest, it might be him. His name was once whispered quietly, then never spoken again. As if saying it too often would break the fragile hope he carried. He didn't speak much either. But when he nodded, or shared a piece of his bread, it was enough to make one night feel a little more human. He moved like a shadow among the piles of snow and tired faces. He never explained. But night after night, he kept crafting them. These objects were not toys. They were reminders. One morning when he didn't show up for the lineup, no one said anything. No one looked for him. But all eyes turned to his sleeping corner. In a system built to erase names, erase memories, erase willpower. Such small acts became a resistance that couldn't be crushed. There are days when even the sky seems to give up. No colors remain but gray. The snow is no longer white, but dirty and dull, marked by the same footsteps and the same cartwheels. The air stands still, so still you can hear snow falling from a dead branch. Not a hug, not a song, but flavor on the tongue. Someone suddenly remembers the warmth of grandmother's soup. Another murmurs about the tart apples from the tree behind the house, embroidering the names of dishes, one by one. Mushroom soup, smoked meat, honey cakes. A long list full of longing. Not an escape from place, but from reality. The body remains here, but the soul has returned to the kitchen at home. to the small dining table bathed in late afternoon light, to the mother's hand scooping food with love. And as long as they could imagine it, as long as they could taste it in their minds, then the cold had not fully won. Then the cloth was hung in secret on a hidden nail, like the flag of a nation that could never be conquered. People began to see it every day, memorize it, recite it in their hearts. And somehow, a starving stomach could hold on a little longer when the heart was full of memory. Someone else talks softly about warm bread and salty butter. And from there, small conversations rise about food, about kitchens, about holidays, about the aroma of morning coffee. Things their bodies may never feel again, but which live vividly in the mind's tongue that cannot be frozen. On days like that, time freezes even more than usual. Movement slows down, not only from fatigue, but because the world itself seems reluctant to turn. Even the guards speak less. They stand like statues atop watchtowers, just as cold, just as silent, occasionally wiping the frost from their gun scopes. In those moments, the most dangerous thought creeps in, a deadly kind of calm. It's not the calm that heals, but the kind that erases. A surrender that doesn't free but drowns. You're no longer afraid of dying, but you don't want to live either. Not because you hate life, but because you no longer remember how it felt. There's no anger, no hope, just numbness. Cold like frozen earth that gives nothing back. It's in this numbness that many begin to quietly give up. Not with grand gestures, not with shouts, but by closing their eyes a little longer, by no longer straightening their bed, by refusing the bread handed to them. Slowly, they fade. Amid that frozen fog, salvation often comes from something small, a memory of taste. These conversations become a kind of warmth no one can steal. In the briefest breaks, in the corners of the barrack, in nights that stretch too long, they exchange culinary memories like treasure. Recipes are whispered like state secrets. How to pickle, how to boil bones for clear broth, how to roll dough so it stays soft. No one has the ingredients. No one can cook, but their tongues live. Their imagination cooks in the void, and the result is more real than the world around them. And from this, something miraculous began. Someone started writing down those recipes on scraps of old fabric. It became the final escape, the most peaceful and most dangerous of all. But not everyone can survive on memories alone. Some are too young to remember much. Young boys thrown into the camp for reasons they don't even understand. Then suddenly wept without cause. Those nearby learned not to ask, not to try to comfort. Only frozen air and a silence that pierced to the bone. He just sat there, not crying, not complaining, just staring at the sky. When a guard asked why he was outside, he quietly replied that he wanted to see if the stars were still there. A simple sentence, but deeply wounding. Because in a world where everything has been taken from you, even the desire to see stars becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Because they knew that in a place like this, sanity was a fragile thing. Not everyone could hold on to it. And there was no system that cared if someone slowly lost themselves. Others are too old to reconstruct faded memories. And for them, those days were like blank pages never written on. They lived in a silence that wasn't just quiet, but void of meaning. Eat, work, sleep. Wake up, work again. No pause, no line separating one day from the next. Only a cycle spinning endlessly within the shadow of barbed wire fences and a sky that never promised change. Some of them began to speak to themselves, as if speaking to someone long gone. They smiled at nothing, laughed quietly into the silence. There was one night when a young man, probably not even 20, sat alone outside the barracks. Snow fell heavily. There was no shelter, no fire. He was forced back inside. But that night, many of us couldn't sleep. His words lingered in our minds, as if reminding us that even the sky can feel distant. From scraps of metal, from leftover wire, from dust and ash. Tiny stars fixed to the walls of the barrack. They didn't shine, they didn't glow. But they were enough to remind us that beyond these walls, the sky still existed. And maybe, even if we couldn't see them, the stars hadn't gone out. That there comes a point when a human isn't just hungry, cold, or tired, but also feels disconnected from the universe itself. That suffering isn't just physical, but about losing one's sense of place. As if the world no longer holds space for us, not on Earth, not in the sky. And that's why, even in a place as bleak as the Gulag, some began to make stars. And everyone in the camp eventually found their own way to stay alive, though sometimes that didn't mean truly living, just not dying. One person began collecting small stones from the frozen ground, quietly arranging them under his bed, forming circles, then lines, then shapes only he understood. Only the melody remained, and the voice within that never died. That voice became his shield when the urge to give up crept in during the long, endless nights. That we would freeze, decay, vanish. No one would ever speak our names again. That's why many began carving their names in hidden places. On the wooden bunks, behind the bathroom walls. On rocks in the forced labor forest. Simple names. Sometimes just initials. But it was a sign that we had lived. That we did not vanish quietly, that some trace remained even if no one ever read it. Others played puzzles in their minds, tracing railway routes, recalling cities from old maps, naming strange places from worn-out books. All of it was an escape not from reality, but from the emptiness. He said it was his house. A house that could not be burned, seized, or taken over by the state. A house that rested in the dark corner of a barrack, no larger than a palm, yet enough to help him last one more day. Another would sing silently to himself, over and over, a song whose original lyrics he had forgotten. Sometimes, prisoners would share made-up stories. Tales about the outside world that had supposedly changed, that the war was over, that the regime had collapsed, that letters would soon arrive. They knew these were lies, but they listened anyway, like children listening to bedtime stories. A place where people were turned into numbers, voices into silence, and history into haze. And for those of us still surviving, the only rebellion left was to feel. To feel hunger, to feel anger, to feel longing, to feel fear, to feel life, even in pain. Because as long as those feelings remained, we knew we hadn't completely disappeared. Because within those lies was a strange calm, as if by repeating the tale, the outside world might somehow be moved to unlock the iron doors of this camp. Strangely, many of us weren't afraid of dying. What we feared most was being forgotten, that no one would ever know we had existed. The Gulag was not just a place of punishment, it was a machine of forgetting. There was one winter more severe than the rest. That year, the temperature dropped to -40, and the wind carried sounds that felt like whispers from another realm. The sky wasn't merely gray, it became a dead shell sealing the earth. No color, no shadow. Even the face of your own friend could blur within the heavy white mist. Their eyes empty, they made no announcements of death, no ceremonies, no condolences. They just carried the frozen bodies away like sacks of grain. Sometimes we thought perhaps they too were already dead, only they hadn't stopped walking. Not about the body, but about seconds. Seconds that passed with one reason: to see one small thing that made you feel human, even for a moment. And in those seconds, we weren't prisoners, we weren't numbers, we weren't shadows. We were simply human, who felt, who hoped, who loved, even if the world had forgotten us. Because who could remain truly alive in a place like this without losing a part of themselves? Days no longer had form. Time lost its meaning. You only knew you were still alive if you could feel your heart beating, though sometimes slowly, lazily, as if the body itself had grown weary of surviving. That's when death began to look different. It didn't come as a frightening threat, but as a quiet relief. Many stopped fighting. They walked more slowly. They slept longer. They didn't wake up again. No screams, no resistance. Just silence that accepted, like frozen ground accepting snowfall. Sometimes we found bodies behind the kitchen, in the bathroom, at the worksite, and always the same. Eyes open, peaceful face, as if they were simply tired. And perhaps that was all. Tired. Those of us who remained alive began counting in secret, silently, without sound or motion, who still rose in the morning, who hadn't eaten in 3 days, who no longer spoke. We didn't name death aloud, not in words, but we remembered in our hearts. And when night came, some of us held another's hand a little tighter than usual, knowing that, perhaps by morning, that hand would be cold and no longer return the grasp. The guards came and went with the same expressions. Yet, amid it all, small things kept appearing. A little bird landing on the fence. A rotten apple somehow found intact. A faint tune heard from the kitchen. The soft laughter of an old man at a silly story that wasn't even funny. Small things that didn't save lives, but delayed collapse. And sometimes, that was all it took. Because surviving the Gulag wasn't about strength. There was an old man in our barracks whom everyone called Professor, though no one knew if he had ever truly taught. His hair was thin, his face hollow, and his voice barely audible. But each night, before sleep settled in, he would tell stories. But we listened. In the darkness, beneath thin blankets and frozen breaths, we listened as the professor built gardens within our minds. We knew it might all be lies, or at least embellished tales. But no one cared, because the gardens he conjured in our imagination felt more real than the cold iron where we slept. Not from objects, not from things, but from words and memory. And sometimes a memory of something soft can be stronger than all the whips and rifles. The professor taught us something no one else had, that hope docenti always come in grand form. Sometimes it hides in whispers, in stories of flowers we've never seen but still choose to believe. Not about politics, not about the system or betrayal. Not like music, but soft vibrations only the quiet heart could hear. He spoke of water dripping from leaves, of wind brushing through grass, of bees buzzing near one's ear. He spoke as if he had truly been there, and strangely, after his stories, the nights felt a bit warmer, as if his words lit a fire we could not see, but could feel. He simply spoke about flowers, about the kinds of blossoms that bloomed in different corners of the world. Why didn't he talk about news or what was really happening beyond the fences? The professor merely smiled and replied softly, because flowers cannot be punished. No one can accuse a flower of conspiracy. No one can arrest jasmine for singing at night. So if we talk about flowers, we are safe. And in that safety, we are free, even for a minute. He would describe the color of rose petals growing on the slopes of Italy, the fragrance of jasmine blooming at night in India, or the falling cherry blossoms in Kyoto. All of it seemed impossible to us, who saw only snow, mud, and rotting wood every day. The professor also loved describing sounds. He said that even flowers had their own voices. Someone once asked him why he always spoke of such unimportant things. That night, I cried quietly. Not from sadness, but from the realization that even in a place as cruel as this, humans could still create beauty. Morning arrived not as we usually know it. The sun didn't blaze in the sky, but merely appeared as a pale blot behind the mist. Days were not measured by hours, but by hunger. The wood we carried no longer felt heavy physically, but heavy in the soul, because that would symbolize a burden that would never end. And every time it fell, we knew we'd be scolded, cursed, maybe beaten. Not because I wanted to give up, but because I wanted to know what he saw. Was there a secret door that opened only to those desperate enough? Or was the sky a mirror, showing a reflection of yourself that had long disappeared? In a world that had stolen everything your name, your freedom, your family, sometimes the only thing you had left was a question. But sometimes no one got angry, and that was more terrifying. Still want to feel, still want to find meaning, even if meaning never comes. And maybe that is the purest form of being human. Not knowing, but searching. Even in the snow, beneath a frozen sky, with trembling bones and a fragile soul, we keep searching. Because when no one is angry, it means we're no longer seen as people. We're just passing shadows, broken things waiting to be discarded. There were moments when your stomach felt like a hollow cave, and your gut's growls were louder than people's voices. And then came moments when hunger vanished altogether, and you began to worry. Because a body that no longer feels hunger is a body that is slowly giving up. And we all knew that. So we asked each other, "Are you hungry?" And if the answer was no, we looked longer into each other's eyes, as if saying, "Not yet. Don't leave yet." There was no warmth, no light, only a shift in the tone of white surrounding us. We did not wake up because of sunlight, but because of the sound of a guard's boots dragging through the snow and branches snapping from the cold. He just stood there, looking up. There was nothing special in the sky, only clouds and snow, but he stared at it for a long time, as if searching for something. A guard approached him and shouted, but the man stayed still. Then he dropped to his knees, then to the ground. There was no blood, no gunshot, but he never got up again. We knew his body still breathed for a few minutes, but his soul had left long before, perhaps toward the gray sky he'd been watching. Some of us woke from the same nightmare, dreams of food falling from our hands, of homes we could no longer touch, of mothers waiting at doorways who could no longer speak. A single day in the Gulag didn't feel like one day. It felt like a chapter in a never-ending novel. Work hours were quiet hours. No conversation, only the sound of tools, of breath, of footsteps sinking into knee-high snow. I once saw a man, young, maybe younger than I was then, stop in the middle of the path. After that, I often looked at the sky too. And sometimes that question was enough to survive. Because as long as we are still asking, it means we haven't given up. We still want to know. Sometimes on the stillest nights, we could hear the snow falling. Not in torrents or crashes, but as a kind of whisper gently descending to the earth, as if the world were writing a secret letter to itself, using white flakes as its letters. In such silence, every breath sounded like a bell, and every heartbeat like a tiny drum that refused to stop. These were the moments when the body felt most exhausted, yet the mind was most alive. A soft laugh in the middle of labor. A lullaby sung gently in a nearly extinct language. And of all the punishments given, the harshest was being forced to become a thing. Something that only moved, only obeyed, only endured. But if even one person could still imagine a flower, or hum a tune in the dark, or cry silently for something once loved, then this place had not yet fully won. The smell of wood smoke briefly reminding us of a New Year's night long before everything changed. These moments were like dew on a frozen window thin, fragile, yet enough to say we were still alive. Because when all outside noise vanished, the only thing left was the contents of your own head. And that could be either a blessing or a curse. Some of us chose silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because there was too much to say, and we didn't know where to begin. Silence became the last protection, the only wall left between reality and madness. Some kept a tiny stone stolen from the frozen river and treated it like a charm. It kept going, but went nowhere. We counted days, not with calendars, but with losses. One friend who didn't wake this morning. One finger frozen and removed. One memory that suddenly vanished and couldn't be recalled again. Sometimes the worst pain wasn't the broken body, but the fading memory. Because if you forget your father's name, your mother's face, your sibling's voice, what's left of you? I once saw a woman stitching invisible thread in the air, as if mending her child's blanket, far away somewhere. And the saddest were those who sat with hands on their knees, staring forward without blinking, as if waiting for a call that would never come. They didn't move, didn't speak, just existed. But there was something in that presence so moving, as if they were guarding the last flicker of a nearly extinguished flame. But others couldn't endure silence. They talked to themselves, sometimes sang without voice, or traced pictures on the frozen wooden wall with their fingers. A circle, then another, a face, a house, a sun that would never come. It wasn't weakness, it was survival. Everyone had a small ritual to keep going. Some hid crumbs of bread in their pockets, even knowing they'd vanish. Time in the Gulag was like a string being pulled, but never cut. And strangely, through it all, small moments still survived. The Gulag wasn't only a place where bodies were broken, it was where the soul was tested to its farthest edge. There is one night I always remember, not because it was special, but because it was so silent that time seemed to stop. The air outside reached a temperature even the old thermometer on the guard post wall couldn't register. Not with beautiful or lengthy words, but with breath. Even a piece of thread wrapped around a finger to remember something. They all became sacred objects, not because of their value, but because of the meaning we gave them. In a world that had stolen everything from us, these small things were our last form of resistance. Just step after step out of the barrack, through knee-high snow, and into a day that pretended nothing had happened. But we knew there was a hole among us, a hole created by those who didn't return. And in our silence, in our slow steps, we filled that hole with memory, with names, with frozen hope, not yet dead. Proof that we still had will, still chose to remember, to hope, even when there was no rational reason to do so. A prayer like an exhale slipped between breaths, as if God could only hear if we were quiet enough. Some whispered the names of their loved ones, very softly, like a mantra. Perhaps so those names wouldn't vanish from the world. I whispered a name that night, too. A name that once made me smile. But that night, it only made me cry. We lay in the barracks like stacked logs, pressing against each other just to steal a little warmth from another body. Yet that night, even the warmth of skin felt unfamiliar. And there was a strange sensation I can't quite describe. Not pain, not fear, but a kind of awareness of death's presence. It didn't appear as a dark figure with a scythe, but as the silence itself. As the air so cold that pain could no longer pierce through. Some never woke again that night. They left like melting snow, quietly, slowly, without a trace. There was no sound, no groans, only silence. The weight of seeing, of remembering, of knowing that we were still here while others were not. And that weight was not light. Yet strangely, it was also what kept us moving, because if not us, who would tell the story? Who would say those names again so the world wouldn't forget? A silence that didn't feel ordinary. A silence that meant something was about to break. Some of us prayed. In moments like that, small things became enormous. A torn scrap of paper with a poem. A pencil stub that could still write a sentence. I woke a few hours before dawn. My stomach was stiff like a stone. My toes had lost all feeling. What remained were we who were still breathing. But that breath was no longer the same. It carried weight. Morning came, not with light, but with command. Get up. Get out. Carry. There was no time to cry. No ceremony. Winter in the Gulag never truly ended. Even when the snow began to melt and the sun teased the sky for more than a few minutes, the cold remained inside the bones. It became a part of your body, like a memory unwilling to leave. Muscles resisted commands. Bones felt like glass, ready to shatter with each forced step. But something strange happened in such exhaustion. You slipped into a space between waking and sleeping, between real and unreal. And there, sometimes, faces appeared. A mother, a child. Someone you once loved, whose voice you no longer remembered. But a quiet pact that we would remain here for as long as we could, with whatever will had not frozen. That even though the world had thrown us away, and history might never say our names, we once existed. We once loved. We once dreamed. And under the starless Siberian sky, that was the one truth that could not be frozen. In that mist, they came, not to save you, but to sit beside you, just to say you were not yet alone. Every gust of wind carried back whispers of nights long gone. Even laughter sounded like an echo from a frozen chamber, not becoming like snow plentiful, formless, and easily scattered by the wind. So we wrote poetry in secret. We drew in frozen dirt. We composed stories in our minds and told them to each other once night fell completely. Not because we wanted to fight, but because we wanted to remember what it felt like to be human. A stolen laugh from stiff lips. A sentence crafted from old words. A tiny dream hidden in the beat of the heart. All of it was rebellion the rifles could never punish. Winter in the Gulag was a state of mind, not just a season. And for many of us, that season lasted a lifetime. Time does not heal wounds the way people say. In a place like this, time merely makes you forget how sharp the pain once was. The hurt doesn't vanish. It just becomes background noise. Like a shrill sound turned into a constant hum that drains you quietly. We learned not to show pain because tears could freeze on your cheeks. And among the eyes of guards and informants, sorrow was weakness. But deep in the chest, the grief kept growing, like roots under frozen soil unseen, but ever creeping. There were days when the body could no longer obey. Some stopped speaking forever, not because they died, but because words no longer served purpose. What use was there in explaining a hunger beyond measure? What worth in describing a cold, even sunlight could not warm? Silence became the language. A language that asked for no reply. A nod, a grasp, a glance that lingered a second longer. That was enough. Sometimes one glance could save your day. Because behind all this suffering, there was still humanity. still a small part of ourselves that refused to be killed by this place. The Gulag was not just about survival. It was about not losing your shape. And when night returned, as it always did, we met it not with fear, but with a kind of agreement, not surrender. There are things history books never teach because they are too quiet to be recorded, too small to be mentioned. Like how we secretly celebrated birthdays with a piece of stale bread shared 5 ways. Or how we made something like a song by tapping spoons on metal poles, creating a rhythm not beautiful, but enough to remind us of the world beyond the barbed wire. Not because he was strong, but because there was no room left to cry. A prisoner suddenly singing a Russian folk tune in the morning mist. Some were written on the back of cigarette papers in writing so small it looked like ant trails. Some were purely spoken, entrusted to a friend who would be released first, memorized down to every punctuation. These letters weren't mere messages. They were reminders that the outside world still existed, that beyond the fence there were eyes that might still cry, hands that still waited. And even if the letter never reached its destination, the hope it left behind was enough to warm the longest night, or a tiny piece of potato found in frozen soil, seemingly meaningless. But on those days, something that small could be a savior, could be a reason to rise, to endure one more hour, one more night. In a place like this, hope wasn't grand. It was small. It whispered. It crept through the tiniest crack in suffering and slowly filled the chest, like water dripping into a cracked jar. Tears had dried long ago, even before the body finally gave in. Behind that smile lived a small world. A world inside the mind, inside memory. A place where a mother still brushed her child's hair, where the smell of potato soup still lingered in a little kitchen. That world wasn't delusion, it was resistance. Because as long as it lived, this body wasn't fully owned by the Gulag. No one remembered exact dates, but we knew the season, felt the mood, saw the faces turning pale, or eyes growing to hollow. Every gesture became a language, because words had long been murdered by fear. Days passed like endless stretched shadows. The sun would appear briefly only to mock, then retreat behind heavy, sluggish gray clouds. When snow melted and mud replaced the white, the suffering did not melt with it. It grew heavier. The mud wrapped around our feet, turning each step into dragging a chunk of dead iron. The cold was no longer sharp, but clung to the skin like damp fog, refusing to leave. And in that weariness, we still worked, lifting, stacking, digging. For a purpose even the guards didn't understand. A hole for another hole. A wall to cover another wall. As if suffering had to be repeated, so it would never be forgotten. We became experts at hiding feelings. A man could lose his brother and still smile at the guard the next day. Sometimes, hope came from the most unexpected places. Then there were letters. Letters smuggled out, or sent with blind hope someone might read them. At some point, we stopped counting the days. The mental calendar we once clung to had been shattered by the realization that no day was different from the next. Monday meant nothing. Holidays were foreign words. New Year passed silently, save for the creak of metal doors and the heavy breaths of shivering prisoners. We no longer lived by time. We lived by climate. Snow, wind, fog, and meal times that never satisfied dictated everything. Clocks had no meaning. There was only morning when the siren rang, midday when the body began to tremble, and night when silence felt like a deep, bottomless hole. They died because no one held them, no one called their name, no one looked into their eyes as a fellow human being. So we said each other's names in soft voices like prayer. In the middle of the night, when no one was listening, we whispered to one another, not to give strength, but to say, "You still exist. I still see you. And even though this world has turned white and frozen, there is still us. Still human beings among the snowflakes and the shadows of wire. Dreams became the only escape. In the world of sleep, we could walk a small road to our home, smell the earth after rain, or hear again the voice of a child calling from afar. But dreams in the Gulag were a cruel game, because when you awoke, reality came like a hammer. A hard bed, frozen air, and hunger that refused to leave even after 10 hours of sleep. Some of us began refusing sleep, preferring to sit and stare into darkness, rather than face the cruelty of illusions that came and went each night. In sleep, you could feel free, but it only made the morning more brutal. Some men began speaking to shadows, not from madness, but from necessity, because your own voice was the only one to answer. Not out of strength, but because there was no other choice. Life in the Gulag was not about courage, but about endurance in the face of loss. Loss of name. Loss of past. Loss of hope. And from that, a new form of humanity emerged. Not noble or heroic, but simple. A prisoner saving a piece of bread for another. A man holding another's body at night just to share warmth. No speeches, no promises. Just small acts that saved a soul from total ruin. They would say the names of people who would never arrive, as if saying their names could make the world real again. Others created imaginary games, counting stones, arranging pieces of wood, drawing a house in the soil with a stick, even knowing the frost would erase it within hours. All these were the remnants of a soul refusing to dissolve, even as the world around it chipped away at it, bit by bit. And still, even as bodies weakened and hearts froze, some endured. We began to understand that sometimes people did not die from cold, hunger, or beatings. The end of winter was not a sign of freedom. The melting snow only revealed earth that was frozen hard as stone, and that ground in springtime did not grow flowers, but bred disease. Everything began to rot. Food stored too long, blankets that never dried, small wounds left untreated. The guards grew crueler, perhaps because they too were pressured by higher commands. Their faces no longer knew smiles, only orders and threats. We resisted it, like eyes too long in the dark suddenly hit by brightness. Light was not hope. Light was a reminder that another day had come, and we were still here, still digging, still hauling, still enduring. Without reason, without a clear end. And in that silence, we knew one thing for certain. No one leaves the Gulag as the same person. If we survived, we would still carry the ice in our bones, the mud in our lungs, and the silence in our souls. For the rest of our lives, we were like worms, forced to dig into soil that did not want to be touched. Some of us began speaking of dreams. Not hope, but nightmares. Of dying in the earth, buried alive by the work that never ended. We asked one another in silence, will we see summer? Death no longer came with sharp ice, but with infections that spread quietly. Yet strangely, that tiny flame still burned. Perhaps because humans are not built to give up so easily. Or perhaps because surrender also requires strength we no longer had. So we kept walking one step in front of another, without a plan, without a goal, simply because stopping hurt more. In the Gulag, survival wasn't about strength, but about habit. Because the body had grown used to wounds, the stomach used to emptiness, and the heart used to loss. A single cough could vanish overnight. A mild fever could be the end without warning. We began to see our bodies not as our own, but as burdens we had to carry, even when they felt unfit to live. Springtime in the Gulag was not birdsong or green fields. It was a shift from one type of suffering to another. Mud replaced ice, and with it came a stench of decay, mixed with the smell of rust, human bodies, and old sweat soaked into worn-out fabric. Paths became slick, not from snow, but from stagnant, foul water. Feet, once numb to cold, were now wounded by the scrape of mud and hidden sharp stones. Yet work did not stop. It increased. Because this season was seen as the most productive, when the ground was soft enough to dig deeper, when stones could be moved without freezing. There was irony in it. While the outside world celebrated blooming flowers and bright skies, we were drained even more. Bodies that were once strong were now just bones and scars. Nights remained long, even as the sun lingered in the sky, but we did not welcome its light. There was one night we would never forget. It's not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing happened at all. The night sky was clear, windless, motionless, as if even nature had stopped breathing. Not ownership in the sense of objects or power, but in the sense of I still exist. When you have nothing, you begin to claim the smallest things. Your own body odor, the taste of stale water in a tin cup, a song, low, trembling, barely audible, but real. There had once been a home. There had once been someone waiting. And even though all of it now felt distant, almost dreamlike, that voice made it real again. For a moment, we were not prisoners, not numbers, not tools. We were someone's child. We were bodies once cradled, hands once held, and hearts that once loved. In the Gulag, for a brief moment, we became human again. And that, amidst all the suffering that wrapped around us, was a small miracle that no one could explain. A man we didn't know who was singing an old song. Not a song of resistance, not political. A song about a spring in his village, about fields of flowers and a mother waiting for her son to come home. That voice was like a small light in the fog, a warm dot in the absolute freeze. No one responded, but we all heard it, and silently we all cried. The rhythm of your footsteps on the snow. all of it became reminders that you were still human, that the system designed to erase your identity hadn't completely succeeded, that there was still a tiny space inside you that hadn't frozen, still a voice that whispered, "I am here. I am still here." In our barracks, everyone was too exhausted to speak. No one laughed, no one cried, not even a complaint escaped. Only the sound of chattering teeth, deep heavy breaths, and the ticking of invisible time. That night, we all became objects. Like the stones outside, holding the cold, silent, without names. The man who usually sang Russian folk songs at work simply sat staring at the wall. The young man who liked to draw with charcoal on wood had fallen asleep with his eyes open. And I just sat there holding a small piece of wood I had slowly carved for weeks. You could barely see anything, not even the face of the man next to you. But we rose, walked, as usual. No questions, no orders. As if our bodies knew the path themselves, had etched the trail of suffering into our muscles and bones. We lifted heavy tools, dug, dragged stones, all in perfect silence. No human voices, only fog, breath, and the groan of earth torn by dull iron. It wasn't a beautiful carving, not even a clear shape, but the wood felt alive, because I had touched it with my own hands. In a place where almost everything you touched felt like it belonged to someone else, to the state, to the guards, to the system. That little piece of wood was the only thing that felt like mine. In the Gulag, a sense of ownership was a luxury unspoken. The morning after that silent night, the fog fell heavy, and suddenly, from deep within the mist, came a soft voice. Not because the song was beautiful, but because it reminded us that behind all this, there had once been life. But no matter how beautiful that small moment was, morning still came with its demands. The singing stopped, the fog lifted, and the weight returned to our backs. There was no time for remembering. The only way we tracked time was by the changing seasons and the number of people who didn't wake up the next day. We counted time not in numbers, but in losses. The prisoner in the next bunk suddenly stopped moving. A workmate didn't appear in the morning lineup. Someone coughed too hard the night before, and now was gone. We spoke to our shadows, to the wooden walls, to the spoons we gripped tightly. We began to accept pain like an old companion, like a wound no longer surprising. The cold no longer stabbed as it once did. It simply existed, like breath, like weight on your back. Pain became a new language, a rhythm that could not be escaped. And in that rhythm, we tucked in small hopes, not hopes of release, but hopes that maybe tomorrow this body could still rise, that maybe another night would bring another voice singing in the mist, that maybe, without realizing it, we had already endured longer than the outside world ever expected us to. Sometimes we even spoke to the snow as if it listened better than humans. Maybe it did. Because in the Gulag, snow was the one thing that was always there. Snow didn't ask questions, didn't judge, didn't betray you. Each loss became a quiet ritual. We didn't cry, we didn't speak names. We only stared ahead, then returned to work. In the Gulag, feelings had to be buried deep, hidden behind breath and hunger. The days returned to their endless chain of tasks. We dug again, chopped wood again, carried loads again. And our bodies, like worn-out tools, began to break down. Joints stiffened, skin peeled, teeth fell one by one. But there were no doctors, only a shared bottle of disinfectant for 30 people. And the hope that our bodies could last one more day. Time in the Gulag did not belong to us. The clock did not tick for us. The calendar didn't celebrate birthdays or mark weekends. Some tried to fight that emptiness by writing. Beneath bunk boards or under stones, they hid small scraps of wood with markings. Not long stories, just brief lines. The name of a child missed, a guest date, a broken poem left unfinished. Food wasn't for fullness, but for simply not collapsing at work. There was no taste, only temperature and texture. And though our stomachs twisted, we learned to chew slowly. Because eating too quickly meant hunger returned sooner. And hunger that returned too soon meant only one thing: the pain would stay longer. Maybe so the world would know we once existed. Maybe just so we wouldn't forget who we were before this place stole our names. But those writings disappeared quickly, confiscated, burned, or lost with the soil we dug. In the Gulag, even memory could be punished. We became creatures who lived from one spoonful to the next. Thin porridge, sometimes still cold. A chunk of fat called soup. Some of us began speaking to ourselves. Not from madness, but because silence to long-left thoughts with nowhere to go. Words once used for conversation became tools for survival. And in that long silence, we learned something strange. There is one thing more terrifying than anything else in the Gulag. Not the whip, not disease, not the endless burden of labor, but spring. When the snow begins to melt and the ground turns to impassable mud, a new voice rises in our minds. Not a voice of hope, but of emptiness. Because spring means another year has passed. And when the year changes, you realize you are still here. We wiped each other's sweat, shared crumbs of bread, and took turns being a crutch when someone was too weak to stand. But because, amidst the rubble of feeling, a spark of humanity still glowed, however small, it was enough. Even when night came without stars, even when the wind bit bone and tomorrow looked like a copy of today, that spark burned in a weak smile, in a hidden song, in a hand brushing against another during labor. And as long as that spark lived, we knew we weren't completely gone. No promises, no sweet words, just looks. And those looks were enough. Because in a world so cold and hard, the warmest thing left was someone who still remembered you were human. That all the work, all the suffering, all the nights you endured have only led you back to the same place. Nothing changes. No letters, no pardon. The seasons shift, but your fate stays frozen. Some of us began to reject that reality. They started sleeping longer than allowed, refusing to rise at the sound of the whistle. At first, we thought they had given up, but then we understood. It was their final form of resistance. In a system that took everything, sleep was the only right left. So they slept in pain, slept in protest, and sometimes they never woke again. We never knew if that was a choice or simply a body that finally gave up. There were also those who tried to escape, even though we all knew no one ever succeeded. Stories of escape became a kind of silent folklore passed between piles of firewood and morning fog. Someone was said to have reached the river. Another vanished during a storm. But there was never certainty. And each time someone tried to flee, all that remained were worn-out shoes near the fence and a name no longer called at roll call. Sometimes we wondered, maybe they were the lucky ones. Better to die running than live slowly eroded by silence. One day, a young guard handed us an old newspaper. He said it was just to pass the time. In it, between advertisements and propaganda, was a small article about farmers in southern Russia having a bountiful harvest. We read that sentence over and over. Not because we cared about wheat, but because it was a sentence from another world. A world that still had harvests, still had seasons, still had words that weren't orders or reports. We held that scrap of paper like a prayer, even though we knew it would be confiscated by tomorrow. Strangely, even through it all, we began forming bonds. Not ordinary friendship, not warm affection, but bonds formed from shared ruin. And maybe that's why we endured. Not because of strength, not from iron resolve, not because we believed in release. One night, after a long day of splitting ice and hauling carts full of firewood, we returned to the barracks earlier than usual. Not because of any kindness from the guards, but because a storm had come quickly, and the wind struck like a whip from the sky. We sat in a circle, shivering, some hugging their knees, others covering their faces with hole-ridden gloves. But it wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of understanding. A feeling that even though we had lost everything, there was still a small corner in our hearts, untouched by the Gulag. They became a silent poem among the rotting wood and leaky roofs. That even in a place built to break you, humans still found a way to be human. Not through strength, but through weakness, through longing, through sorrow. And in that sorrow, we drew closer to one another, not in words, but in shared breath, in shared hunger, in a shared song, even if we never sang it right. Whenever the wind blew too hard, or when the night felt too long, we repeated those words in our hearts, not for him, but for ourselves. So we wouldn't forget that even in a place like this, it was still possible to be remembered, still possible to have meaning. And that was a small victory. Unwritten, unrecorded, but real. There was no light, just the remnants of a small fire that couldn't warm even our toes. Then, from a dark corner, someone began to hum. A folk tune, perhaps from Ukraine or Belarus, we weren't sure. But the melody was familiar. The voice was soft, trembling, but it flowed. One by one, we joined in the hum. Not because we knew the lyrics, but because we understood the feeling. The feeling of longing for a home that might no longer exist. The desire to sleep under a mother's blanket. The yearning to smell a kitchen's morning aroma. The song was not long and no one sang it properly. But it was enough. We closed our eyes and let the sound carry us back in time. as if the clock rewound, and for a few minutes we were no longer prisoners. We were children, farmers, bakers, ordinary men who once had lives. When the song ended, no one spoke. Silence wrapped the room like a thick fog. The next morning, the one who sang that song was moved. We never learned where to. Some said he was taken to the medical camp with a high fever. Others claimed he spoke too much in his sleep and angered a guard. We didn't know the truth. What we did know was that his bed was empty and no one dared to sleep there for days. On his thin mattress, someone had quietly scratched a message with charcoal. "Remember me when you sing." Oh, those words stayed in our heads. And that was the most bitter and most beautiful lesson of the Gulag. Time in the Gulag didn't move like time elsewhere. It didn't flow, didn't turn, didn't pass. It simply froze. Each day felt like a copy of the last. One carved the face of his child. Another made a tiny cross. One man spoke about the sound of his wife's voice calling from the kitchen. Another about a small road to school covered with autumn leaves. To open your eyes the next morning, to walk into the forest, though your legs trembled, to still grip your spoon, though your hands were numb, to wait, because in the Gulag, waiting was the highest form of courage. Waiting with patience, waiting without promise, waiting without knowing who it was for. I often remembered the sound of my father singing softly in the morning. That voice sometimes visited me in dreams, so vivid I'd wake up with wet eyes. Those stories were like small windows opening into a lost world. And when we spoke them aloud, the walls of the Gulag seemed to crack, just for a moment. Others simply etched a birth date onto the handle of a spoon. These objects were hidden like gold. If discovered, they'd be destroyed, and their owners punished. But they kept making them, because inside those objects lived something that couldn't be taken away. A sense of possession. A reminder that we had once been someone. Once mattered. Once were loved. Every sound, every step, even hunger, felt like a repetition with no end. And since time didn't change, memory became the only thing that moved. Days when the snow fell too heavily or food arrived too late. On such days, even breathing became a burden. We just sat, letting the frozen time bite us piece by piece. No protest, no screams, just silence. And in that silence, we learned that the deepest suffering wasn't pain, but the loss of words. When you no longer knew what to say, that was when your soul began to fade. In our minds, the past was a river running beneath the snow-covered walls. We replayed memories of small dinner tables, the sound of school bells, the scent of autumn over a field of potatoes. Things we once thought insignificant had become treasures we held tightly inside. Some prisoners made small objects from leftover wood or bone. Sometimes, when the guards were too tired or too bored to patrol, we told stories. Not grand tales, not heroic legends, just simple stories. But there were days when no one spoke. Yet strangely, from that silence, strength would sometimes rise. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to endure. By the third month, fingernails began to fall off. Not all at once, not dramatically. They just peeled away slowly, one by one, like dried bark flaking from a dying tree. Our hands no longer belonged to humans, but to exhausted machines, cracked, bleeding, and void of sensation. In the mornings, we had to dip them into the snow to wake them again, like frozen roots forced back into life. No one complained, no one asked why, because no one had an answer. We drank water by breaking our own ice. Sometimes the ice was clear, sometimes brownish, carrying mud and dead leaves from past seasons, but it was still water. We boiled it in old paint cans, inhaling the steam as if it were luxury tea from a world we no longer touched. The smell of rotting meat in the mess hall meant it was the fourth day. The scent of soap from the guard's shed meant clothing rationed day once a month, if lucky. And if the barracks were suddenly cleaned, we knew there would be an inspection. Inspection meant commotion. It meant a longer night. It meant someone would be called out and never return. When the can boiled, we stood in a circle not to take turns sipping, but to warm our hands. Even a single sip of water felt like victory, and draw tiny lines in the dirt with his finger. To keep rising, even when there was no reason. To keep writing poems in disappearing soil. To keep dipping our hands into snow, even knowing the pain would return with sensation. In a world that had stripped everything from us, repetition became a form of rebellion, because as long as we could repeat, we were still alive, still present. He said it was a form of visual poetry, like he once taught at the university. We didn't understand its meaning, but we liked watching him do it. The lines looked like hope etched in mud. By morning, they were gone, erased by boots and sludge, but he would draw them again, and again, and again, like a silent celebration that needed no cheers. We began telling time in strange ways. Not by the sun, because the sun rarely appeared, but by scent. One of my roommates was an old professor. He didn't speak much, but on certain nights he would sit. Sometimes I thought that perhaps the only form of freedom we had left was our ability to repeat. There were days when hail fell from the sky like tiny nails thrown from a great height. We had no proper coats, just thin, worn-out layers that no longer resembled clothing. We wrapped our bodies in whatever we could, grain sacks, torn blankets, even newspaper found who knows where. But nothing could stop the sting of that cold. When hail fell, we knew our skin would tear, and those wounds would never have time to heal. In the Gulag, wounds weren't special. They were ordinary, like breath or hunger. They weren't treated, discussed, or cried over. They simply existed. One night, I can never forget, the temperature dropped so drastically that the door to the barracks froze shut. We were all trapped inside. There was no wood for fire, and our own bodies became the last source of warmth. They remained sitting, their faces frozen in neutral expressions, as if they had merely fallen asleep peacefully. There were no tears. No prayers. We simply dragged their bodies outside and covered their faces with cloth. Death no longer surprised us. It had become a small door that opened between long rows of identical days. It came quietly, without ceremony. We sat close together, so close our bones touched. Work had to continue. Forests still needed cutting. Snow still needed clearing. Life in the Gulag gave no room for gentleness. Yet within that indifference, we found a new form of resistance. We kept working, we kept walking, we kept living, 'cause for us, every step was proof we hadn't given up. That though our bodies were broken, our spirits had not been extinguished. No one spoke. Only the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional creak from the wooden ceiling filled the darkness. In that black stillness, I felt the heartbeat of the man beside me. It was weak, but there, and that was enough to get me through that night. Sometimes it isn't fire that saves you, but presence, someone near, still alive, still here. The next morning, when the door was finally forced open, 2 men did not rise. After that, the day resumed as usual. There was no pause for mourning, no time for sorrow. At a certain point, even pain becomes familiar, stops being the enemy, and turns into a quiet traveling companion. When your body aches with every movement, you stop questioning it. You just move. When your stomach is empty and filled only with icy water, you no longer pray for food, but simply hope to make it through the day. Hope becomes simplified, no longer about freedom or going home or forgiveness, but about small things, like not collapsing under the weight of the wood. Even time became liquid, with no beginning or end. But we kept going, whether out of strength or simply from being too tired to die, perhaps both. But in the middle of it all, one thing remained true, that even in the darkest place, a human can still carry light, not a blazing light, but a small, dim one, like the flicker of a candle held tightly in the chest. A light just bright enough to guide one step forward. And sometimes, that alone is enough. Like warming your hands for even a single minute. Like hearing someone softly greet you in the silence. Some of us began to build small worlds inside our heads. Worlds the guards couldn't steal, the snow couldn't freeze, and mockery or punishment couldn't erase. She used to read me bedtime stories, her gentle voice like dew falling onto wooden windows. Sometimes, when the Gulag nights were so quiet that my heartbeat seemed too loud, I closed my eyes and imagined her sitting beside me, reading that same story again. I knew it was just a fantasy, but it was the only thing that kept me from breaking. A memory that outlasted the body. One prisoner named Oleg always imagined he was a baker in a small village. He would whisper to us at night about his bakery by the river, about the smell of warm wheat filling the morning, about children coming to buy bread with copper coins. We all knew it was a lie, but no one ever said so. Because within that lie, we all found another reality more livable than this one. I myself began to recall my mother's voice. I could no longer remember her face clearly, but her voice remained in the depths of my memory. Days passed, one by one, like snow that never stopped falling. We lost count. We lost seasons. On one morning, wrapped in a thin fog and a cold that pierced straight through the spine, we were all gathered in the main yard. No one knew why. The guards stood in formation with their rifles raised, their faces like stone walls, expressionless. We stood in long rows, heads bowed, suppressing our shivers. None of us dared to move too much, afraid a small gesture could be mistaken for defiance. In the Gulag, silence was safety. And when the command came, no one asked questions. But I walked again, back to the quarry, back to the pickaxe, and no one asked how I was, because everyone knew the answer was the same. Not well. No one was well there. We were all just waiting for the season to pass, for the snow to melt, for our names to be called, whether for release or for death. And sometimes we weren't sure which one we hoped for more. We simply walked as ordered, toward a place in the frozen forest we had never seen before. It was a newly opened stone quarry, a gaping wound in the snowy landscape. The smell of wet earth mixed with metal stung our noses. But they still came to the quarry, 'cause if you didn't, you'd be marked as disobedient. And that meant one place: solitary confinement. There was no light, no food, just 4 stone walls, dripping water from the ceiling, and the sound of your own heartbeat growing weaker by the day. Many emerged from solitary not as men, but as hollow shells that walked. There were no machines, only pickaxes and shovels, and our strength to dig without pause. That's where we would work for the coming months. That was all. No one defended me. No one visited. And I didn't expect anyone to. Because in the Gulag, the law wasn't the law of the state, but the law of silence. Survive alone, speak as little as possible, and never look alive. While in solitary, I spoke to myself, not to stay sane, but to remind myself I still had a voice, that I hadn't completely disappeared into the cold. Food was distributed more sparsely than before. There were no new barracks. We slept in thin tents made from wooden poles and torn sheets of plastic. The wind cut through us without mercy. We slept clinging to one another, relying on the heat of a friend's body to avoid freezing to death in our sleep. There, I saw men's hands begin to rot, fingers blackened from frostbite. Some lost nails, some lost entire hands. I was once sent there for 3 days, not for fighting back, but because I sat down a little too long during lunch. When I came out, the world felt strange. The light was too bright, the sound too loud. There was an old man everyone called Semyon. No one knew his real name or where he came from. He had been in the Gulag so long, even the younger guards treated him like part of the landscape, like an old tree that no longer grows, but also cannot be cut down. The sound of water in the river near home, even the taste of warm bread or the scent of soil after rain. We stored them in a secret box inside our thoughts, echoing in the dark, in our heavy steps, in every swing of the pickaxe. We no longer heard Semyon's voice, but we knew he was still there, in memory, in the air we breathed, in the pain we endured, but also in the small courage we kept inside our chests. Because sometimes, to survive in a frozen hell, all you need is not great strength, but a single old hum repeated over and over, just to keep from losing yourself completely. Because we realized our bodies might be broken, but as long as we could remember, we weren't completely dead. The Gulag couldn't kill everything, and somehow that became the quietest form of rebellion. To survive by remembering. Semyon didn't speak much, but every night when we gathered quietly in the tent, he would sit in the corner and start to hum. It wasn't a song. It wasn't a prayer. more like the melody of memories too old to be spoken aloud. We never knew the meaning of that hum, but we liked it, because in a world full of commands and prohibitions, Semyon's voice felt like the one thing no one could silence. He hummed even in snowstorms, even when his body shivered, even when his feet bled. One night, I dared to ask him what he was singing. Semyon gave a faint smile and said, "I'm singing the things I want to remember, so the world doesn't steal them from me." That sentence planted itself deep in my mind. Because in a place like the Gulag, memory is the only treasure that cannot be confiscated. Many of us started to imitate his habit, not singing, but repeating small things in our minds. A mother's name, a child's face. Semyon died one morning when snow fell gently like ash. There was no ceremony, no mourners. He was simply carried out of the tent, his body wrapped in a burlap sack, then tossed into a communal pit frozen with ice. But that night, we all hummed. In soft voices and broken tones, we sang whatever fragments we could recall from Semyon's whispers. It wasn't a tribute. It wasn't resistance. It was just a quiet thank you from the living to the one man who once made life feel like something that could be sung. And from that night on, the hum lived among us. At the end of that winter, something strange happened. A new guard arrived, young and visibly uneasy, as if he wasn't used to a place this dark. He carried a small notebook and asked each of us for our full name, place of origin, year of imprisonment. We had been offered false hope too many times, only to fall deeper into the abyss of disappointment. A man in a different uniform arrived, his face calm, his steps sure. He read name after name from a long list. That voice felt like a bullet cutting through silence, not to kill, but to free. Some names we recognized, some we didn't, but every name called out felt like a bell ringing inside our chests. I didn't expect my name to be there, but when it was called, the world paused for a moment. I stood, legs trembling, breath catching. There were no hugs, no tears, just a slow walk toward the gate we had only ever seen from a distance. But still, every night, we began to dream. Not big dreams, just small, simple ones. Walking without being yelled at. The air beyond the fence felt different. The same sun, but its rays reached deeper, as if touching bones that had long gone cold. That first step felt like a dream, like crossing an invisible line between the living and the forgotten. Some of us cried, not out of joy, but because our bodies didn't know how to accept freedom. We had lived within walls too long, and now there were no more walls in front of us, just road and sky and snow slowly melting, sitting without being watched, seeing the sky without barbed wire framing it. Even the oldest among us, with faces like aged wood and hands like twisted roots, started to speak quietly about home, about children who might not remember, about wives who might have remarried. But that didn't matter. They just wanted to see the river one more time. That would be enough. It was odd. Usually our identities no longer mattered. We were just numbers. But this time our voices were asked for. Our words were written down. And whispers began to bloom like frost on a window. Rumors of mass release. of a policy change in the capital, of letters that somehow, from somewhere, had finally reached the desks of those in power. Of course, no one really believed it. And then, the day came. We weren't given money, nor a map, only a release letter and a piece of dry bread. But for us, that was more than enough. They said we were free, but no one truly knew what freedom meant after years spent in iron chains and walls of ice. Our steps were hesitant, like children learning to walk for the first time. The world outside the Gulag was too vast, too noisy, too alive. Even the silence of the forest felt foreign to ears, accustomed to shouted commands and the creak of metal. Out here, there were no fences setting boundaries, no morning sirens forcing us awake, no numbers to determine who lived and who merely endured. Some of us chose not to go far. They built wooden shacks not far from the Gulag grounds, living off hunting and gathering. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps there was no one waiting beyond the trees. The world had changed, and we were no longer part of it. Not to forget, but so I could begin from something that didn't come from chains. But morning always came, and the sunlight, though pale, always forced me to keep walking. I found work cleaning a storage room, then carrying water, and eventually writing notes for an old carpenter who couldn't read. I learned that the world isn't always cruel, but it's also not always fair. But at least the world outside offered choices. And that, for someone who once lived in a gulag, was the truest kind of freedom. The right to make your own mistakes. In the first village I passed through, people looked at me with suspicion. I could understand that. My clothes were torn, my body thin like a shadow. But an old woman gave me a piece of bread and said that those who suffer bring blessings to the fields. I didn't know what she meant, but I kept that sentence in my mind, like I once kept Simeon's humming, as a talisman so I wouldn't lose my way. The letters that had never arrived, the homes that once existed all, had become shadows we could no longer reach. So they stayed, become shadows of a system that no longer existed, but also had never truly disappeared. They planted potatoes in the soil that had once swallowed the bones of their comrades. They called it land, sanctified by suffering. I walked farther, with scars on my back and a new name I chose for myself. The nights were still hard. Sometimes I would wake suddenly, my thoughts still trapped among the shabby tents and the smell of iron. Time passed slowly, like a snow-covered river. I no longer marked the days with scratches on the wall or thread beneath my pillow. Time became blurry, not from suffering, but from a peace that felt unfamiliar. Sometimes I would sit behind my small wooden house, staring at the gray sky. There were days when the sky looked like an old, sleepy face. I watched the birds fly and wondered if they ever knew boundaries, camp boundaries, human boundaries, or if they simply flew because it was the only thing they knew how to do. I never returned to my hometown, not out of fear, but because I knew the city wouldn't recognize me anymore, just to save the voice that still lived inside my body. They creep into the way someone walks, the way someone laughs, the way someone stays silent. I know this. I live with it. But I do not hate that wound. I don't want to forget it, because inside it are the names of those who once walked beside me during the long nights under a pale moon. names that will not be spoken at memorials, but that live within my bones. The voice from dark nights, from leaky tents, from Semyon's voice that now remains only as an echo. I wrote so that those names wouldn't die completely, so that those erased from the state's archives would still live in the tiny letters I etched with a blunt pencil. There, I would probably just be a ghost passing through without a name. People outside of prison think time stands still for those inside. They don't know that time changes form. It becomes thick, sticky, sometimes deadly. It's not the ticking of a clock, but the creaking of bones in the morning. Not seconds, but breath forced to persist in -30 degrees. I began to write. On old tobacco paper, on discarded planks, on the backs of burlap sacks. Not to be published, not for others to read. People say wounds will heal, but deep wounds don't heal. They change shape. They grow roots. Not all of us survived, and not all who survived remained whole. Some left the Gulag with bodies still able to move, but their souls stayed buried beneath the snow, frozen near bones that were never given a proper grave. But they could not silence the memories whispered from one soul to another. But in the life we held on to, we learned that even from the darkest place, a small light can still grow. An understanding, a poem carved into the wall of a wooden room, a song whispered in the dark, a sentence simple enough to save us. I am still alive. Behind statistics and burned archives, there is a truth that continues to breathe in quiet nights in the cries of a child who doesn't understand why his mother never returned, in the old man still startled by the slam of a door. We are not heroes. We are not martyrs. We are simply people who once fell too deep into a pit dug by fellow men. History will not record our names. There will be no marble monuments or brass plaques, but there is a voice, like a whisper behind the northern wind, that remains alive, refusing to vanish. They could take away our freedom, force us to kneel, rewrite our stories, even erase our traces from official records. The Gulag is not just a place. It is a memory that refuses to die. It is a winter that never ends. And for the long nights you spend alone, if one day you feel frozen, unheard, hopeless, remember that in the coldest place on earth, amid snow and iron, the human voice still endured. And maybe that is enough to keep us walking forward.